Us. Welcome. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Victoria Herman, and I am so excited to welcome everyone to our Breaking the Ice Ceiling webinar today. We will be hearing from two amazing speakers about educating about and from the poles and a humble approach to polar teaching. I will be bringing on our speakers in just a moment, but for those of you who have just joined us, if you head over to the chat, you can see where everyone is geographically located today and add where you are. So we can see just how many people and just how many places are here together to learn about STEM education and exploring gender histories in the classroom from pole to pole. We are going to hear from two speakers today, and we will hear from both of them before moving into a lively discussion of questions and answers. I will be monitoring the chat throughout both of our presentations today. So if you have any questions about the logistics of our Zoom, please head over to the chat box and let me know at any point. More importantly, as you are listening to our two speakers, if you have questions for them, please put those questions in the chat box. I will direct message you as you are asking them to ask if you would like to come on and ask either verbally or on video in our question and answer, or if you're in a place with low internet connection or are in a noisy atmosphere, if you would like me to read that out loud for you. I will be reminding you throughout these presentations in the chat to please not be shy about asking and engaging in our discussion. The best discussions are when as many people as possible ask questions, make comments, bring their own experiences into the conversation. So please make sure to join us in the question and answer afterwards. If, however, you have to run out of our Zoom for another meeting or dinner, if you are on the later end of our time zones, don't fret. We are recording this and we will be sending out a recording shortly after the webinar is finished. Okay, that is enough from me. So I am beyond excited to bring on our first speaker, Janetburton, who has managed the education program at ARCIS, the Arctic Research Consortium of the United States, since 2000. In that time, she has helped send dozens of teachers on research expeditions to the Arctic and the Antarctic. She's lived and worked across the state of Alaska and currently lives in Anchorage. Today, she will be exploring together with us how we can educate about and from the poles through her more than 2 decades of experience leading just that. So I am going to spotlight our first speaker, ask her to make a brief, maybe more personal introduction before jumping into her presentation. Janet, I am giving my virtual mic over to you.
All right, thank you so much. And I'm actually going to start sharing just because I need to do that. Because I'm not
Janet,
very good at
we might not be able to hear you.
Oh, okay. I don't know why I'm talking. Let me see. Let me.
Up, we can hear. You're good.
Okay. Okay. All right. Very good. And I hopefully you're also seeing my screen and a intro slide. Okay. So, yeah, hello, and gosh, it's really exciting to see where everybody's coming from around the globe here. I want to thank Victoria for letting me present today and inviting me to this really interesting webinar series. So before I begin, just kind of like Victoria said, I'd like to give you a little introduction about myself and how how this journey all began. So I am Janet Warburton, and as Victoria mentioned, I'm an education project manager for the Arctic Research Consortium of the United States. It's a mouthful. We call it ARCUS for short. And I'll get more into about ARCUS in a little bit, but I'm originally from Colorado, which is actually where I'm presenting from today. And I moved to Alaska to attend college at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. And it was my dream, and I to go to the Arctic. Apparently, when I was in second grade, and my mother saved this report. So all you parents out there, saving reports is okay, because in second grade, I drew a map of the state of Alaska, and I said that I wanted to be a scientist and study walrus. So in 1982, when I stepped off the airplane in Fairbanks, Alaska, I never looked back. It was really my passion to explore Alaska, and in particular the Arctic, and to work with marine mammals, which I did. For a long time, I worked for the federal government, and in that capacity, I was able to travel around this amazing state and work with a lot of people in and around the state. And I lived in the Northwest Arctic portion of the state for a long time. And it was there that I started to really kind of narrow and find out that I wasn't really wanting to be a scientist in that sense, and that I really, really enjoyed working with communities, and in particular engaging students in we call it immersive experiences. And so I worked for the school district for a while and created culture camps and science expedition kind of camps for students in the region, which led me to my work into ARCUS. In 2000, I moved from the Northwest Arctic to Fairbanks, Alaska, and started working for ARCUS. And so that's really the beginning of what you're going to hear about today. Is I have this science background, I have an education background, and it poised me to start creating and developing programs that connect scientists with communities and students and educators, particularly in the United States, but also kind of circumpolar. So before I begin, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this practice, but in the state of Alaska, it's important for us to give land acknowledgement and recognize both ancestral territories and places for the indigenous people. And I'd like to recognize the Dena'ina Athabaskan. They are the tribal group for Anchorage, Alaska, where I work. And I owe deep gratitude to these people and across the far north for their continued care and stewardship of the land from which I work. Today, I sit on the lands of the Southern Ute, and I'm grateful to the experience and beauty of the Southwestern United States. So I always like to recognize where we are, our place on this planet. So to get started, whoops, of course, I'm having technical issues right off the bat. Okay, so today's presentation is really called STEM at the Polls, and I want to recognize Judy Fonstock, my colleague, who I believe is online today, Angela Larson, and Jen Danielson, who work for Goldstream Group. They are the evaluators of our project. I am going to spend a lot of time on Polar Trek, and then I will also get into some other education activities that ARCUS is working with. So I mentioned that I work for this organization, and Victoria also mentioned it, called Arctic Research Consortium of the United States. And it's a nonprofit that's based in Fairbanks, Alaska, although most of our employees are spread across the United States and do work remotely, like I am. As an international member-based organization, we're involved in a lot of programs and support science, including one of our signature programs, the Polar Trek program. And you can learn all about ARCUS through our website, which isn't actually listed here, but it's arcus.org. So Today, I want to give you a little bit of background about Polar Trek, which is actually an acronym for Teachers and Researchers Exploring and Collaborating. First of all, it's a professional development program that I started. Really, it was a spinoff from 2004. I had an opportunity to place teachers with researchers in various Arctic locations. We hadn't expanded to Antarctica yet. And I used my background and my experience in immersive student-based experiences, as well as looking at research centered on how teachers learn and how do you get teachers professional development and those kinds of things. And I also looked at some other programs that were already around. There is a program called Learns in New Zealand. So if any of you are from that area, and I learned a lot about how they did their professional development for teachers. And the whole idea was to actually get teachers connected with researchers so that they could become better at teaching science. And in our case, we had a request from researchers, the research community, the polar ones, to wanting to get their research out to a bigger, more people, not just within their framework. And also to help teachers teach about polar science. So it was kind of this was kind of the beginnings of Polar Trek. And in 2007, some of you may be aware, that was the beginning of the International Polar Year. It was a big international effort to focus on polar sciences. It was a research effort, and with it came also an education and outreach effort. And ARCUS was part of that and part of the planning stages of education outreach effort. And with it, of course, came some funding and an opportunity for us to expand what we were already doing in the Arctic and expand it to the Arctic and Antarctic and start really refining what we wanted to do in this area of teacher research experiences and getting teachers familiar with polar science. So, initially, our Polar Trek program during the International Polar Year was to focus on formal classroom teachers. For those of you not familiar with these terms, I can't see it in chat, but formal classroom in our case are teachers that are working within the classroom, and then I'll refer to informal educators, and those are the people that work with a variety of different audiences, typically in museum settings or out of the classroom situations. And there's a lot of camps is another good example of informal education. So I'll use those terminologies. And the original Polar Trek program focused on U.S. teachers and focused on teachers working in that traditional formal classroom. During the International Polar Year. In recent years, starting in 2019, we have expanded our program to include that informal educator component, and I'll get into that in a little bit later. The idea behind that is mostly to expand the scope. Informal educators reach out to different kinds of audiences in their work, and that was a point that scientists wanted to have their work not just in formal classrooms, but also in informal learning settings. So another unique aspect of Polar Trek is that our participants are getting support for these experiences, both before, during, and after their field-based research experience. We call these experiences expeditions, so you'll hear me use that term. During all these experiences or expeditions are STEM focused, another kind of educator-centric acronym. STEM means science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And so we tried to place educators with researchers that have kind of research that includes at least technology, engineering, or math. And then during the experience, the educators become team members, fulfilling a variety of roles, and such as research technician, manual labor, educator, data observer, etc., and they fulfill the distinctive role of public outreach officer. The field season is only part of the experience, and when they return back from their expedition, they are expected to integrate their experience into their instruction and continue doing public outreach, making this part of their ongoing professional development. And then a final distinctive characteristic about Polar Trek, which I will get into a lot, is the evaluation program. So our vision, like any program, we have specific goals and objectives that we want to see happen through this program. So our main one is to create and improve the quality and authenticity of science teaching, and we have the following objectives that we developed, and we also get evaluated. So we want to improve our participants' STEM content knowledge. There's that word again. We want to increase the educators' knowledge and use of those STEM practices. We want to build educators' identity within the STEM field. So do they associate themselves as scientists after our program? We want to increase their collaborations between the formal and informal educators. And then, of course, we also want their students, and in this case, students are mostly middle to high school students. That's kind of the age group. So if you aren't in a U.S. system, it would probably be about age 11 to 16. And we want to increase students' understanding and their engagement. Oh, I said that. We, of course, want them to learn more about the polar regions. That's one of the big things. And then the other piece for professional development is that relationship building. We want the teachers and participants to build a relationship between the education community and the research communities. So how do we do this? Well, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, it is a multi-layered program, and we've been doing it for several decades now, or over a decade now, and so it definitely has lots and lots of layers. And Judy, if she's still there, she can respond to some of the chat about those kinds of things. But Judy and I work together. We are a two-person team for this program, I might add, for full-time purposes. And we do have other help from ARCUS. We're only an organization of 15, 18 people, but we all have different things to work on, and there's only two of us that work in education programming, and Judy's one of them. So we do bring other people in, like IT, and we also utilize alumni in our program. So we have a 1-week orientation, pre-COVID times. I'll get to that in a little while. And it's very intensive. We bring people in for a week-long training, typically in Fairbanks, Alaska. Our funding provides for all of this travel and for the training. And we go through all the program aspects. They get to learn about safety training, what it's like, hear from people about what it's like to go to the polar regions, because the people that are selected for this program and that are going out into the field with the researchers have never had a field research experience. I forgot to mention that earlier. These are teachers, educators that have never been on anything like this typically ever before, and especially in the polar regions. So there's a lot of training and a lot of discussion about expectations, safety, what are the polar regions. You can hear science. We have presentations from scientists, etc., about the polar regions. So that's the 1-week orientation. Then there's also webinars that continue after that we do to kind of get our participants prepared. We also, another unique feature of our program is the selection process, and in the sense that when you apply to go on this, apply to Polar Trek, you there's an extensive application, a lot of questions, but not only are the teachers or educators applying to the program, we also have the researchers applying to the program. The researchers apply to host an educator, and so they also go through an application process. And part of that, there's a lot of, there's like a selection committee that reviews all the applications, and there's different stages of the application process, and you kind of move. If you've passed level 1, you go to level 2, and by level 3, you'll get matched up with a researcher, and then they decide to interview you. And typically, it's been a year, over a year since we've had this process, so it's like, oh, what happened? Anyway, we have researchers interview their applicants by webinar and Zoom, and then they select them. So Judy and I don't do the final selections. We leave that up to the team, because it's very important that the team makes that selection, because they know who can integrate into the field research project well, and things like that. We involve alumni throughout this project process. We cover tons of expenses, such as substitute teachers if the expedition's during the school year. And like I mentioned before, it's not just a field experience. We do the support before, during, and after. And they have access to information, resources, and us long after their field experience. This is just to give you an idea of where these expeditions take place. So researchers that have applied and are and they hosted a Polar Trek educator. This is just some of the geographic locations and of where those expeditions take place. We have gone everywhere. We've put researchers in teams throughout the circumpolar Arctic as well as Antarctica, as the stars show you. The research projects are also as diverse as the locations, and they're in disciplines like physical and biological oceanography, sea ice, glaciers, archaeology, tundra plants and terrestrial ecology, seabirds, fish, polar bears, atmospheric studies, and more. So a lot of depth and breadth to the placements. One thing I didn't mention is that we only are funded to place 12 teams or 12 participants per year. So the reason is because of the location that we're going to. So the placements, the 12 educators that get selected, they're supported through us. Of course, ARCUS administers the program, but we get funding from, over the years, from the National Science Foundation, in particular the Office of Polar Programs, and different awards, different parameters per award, but overall NSF has been the major funder of our program. We also have had NASA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and maybe National Park Service, I can't remember, way back when. Currently, our logistics to support these individuals and getting them to and from these crazy places is provided through NSF contract logistics, and they take care of the travel, clothing, and equipment, and any safety training that they need to and from the Arctic and Antarctica. And with our award, we pay for all the rest, all the training and substitutes to schools if needed, and things like that. The research, so now I'm going to kind of shift a little bit. I wanted to go into the different aspects of what makes up a Polar Trek experience. So at the heart, of course, is the actual field-based polar research experience. And so, like I mentioned, the educator is matched up with a researcher. You saw the stars where they go to. These experiences last anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks. They can be ship-based. Those are usually the longer ones, and they can be up to 8 weeks. It's very intensive, and so there's a lot of if you are a field researcher, you know that it's not like being at the lab or like being at your home institution or being at home. It's a completely different world. And so there's a lot of training that goes into preparing for these educators. And also with the researchers, we work with the researchers because many of them have not, this is their first, have had an experience with an educator on their team. They've had grad students, or maybe they have undergrads, or maybe they'll have film or media people on their team, but they haven't had a teacher on their team. And so we work with the researchers also about what the expectations are there. Because we want the experience to be immersive, it's very important, as that is one of the key elements of how people learn and how they retain things long after that experience. There's some studies that have been done that you need to have at least 5 to 7 days of an immersive experience so that it sits up here in your head and it becomes part of your life experiences. So that's why we shoot for at least 3 to 6 weeks, and we really strive for the educators to do all aspects of that science. While they're out in the field, they also are expected to communicate daily, and I'll talk about that. With the rest of us, and they share their experience. I've mentioned this a couple different ways. The program is really about professional development. It's not just about that field experience, but it's also it's really about not only raising awareness about the polar regions, but also how the educators teach science when they get back to their learning setting. So from our alumni, we've heard that these kinds of experiences give them a new understanding about the process of science and scientific research. It gives them experience using a number of different tools and techniques that they can now take back to their learning settings or classrooms. It shows them the importance of teamwork in science. It provides their students with primary sources of information to work with, a really key piece, at least in the United States and in science education circles, about access to primary sources that is not coming through textbooks. They have a direct link to the research community, and it provides, again, that student to researcher connection that doesn't come with most science education programming. I mentioned that we do a lot of outreach, and we interwoven through almost every aspect of our program are some outreach tools or activities. And we do give all of our participants tools like computers, cameras, and things so that they can be successful at their outreach. We do these, we call them Polar Connect presentations, but they're really real-time live seminars from the field. I've heard from researchers over the years, oh, there's no way that they can connect off of the ship or in that field or whatever. Well, we can do some amazing things with satellite phones and texting, and we just managed to work our way. So we try to have at least one real-time event from the field, because there's nothing like hearing the wind blowing behind the scenes or seeing them out standing in the tundra swatting mosquitoes to really give you a sense of what it's like to be in there in the field. In the polar regions. We also do online blogging or journaling. It serves two purposes. It's for the public, of course, to hear what's going on and to learn more about, experience the polar regions. But it's also a learning tool, a learning processing tool for people. If you write things down, you can reference it later, but it also helps up here retain that some of the immersive experience. We also have a way for them to share photos, both during their expedition and then afterwards. We have an incredible photo media archive. And you can use those photos for your own purposes. They're taken mostly by educators. And the photos are also used in their products or lesson plans or presentations when they go back to implement these things in their classrooms or conduct programs. And photos, who doesn't like photos and videos? It is definitely a way to capture what their experience was like. One final thing that they do, it's more outreach, is that they have to create 2 lesson plans or a product about their experience that gets added to our resources section of the Polar Trek website. Again, these are things that anybody can use. And they also have to do a report. We call it the STEM Experience Report, but it's really a report like many researchers write field reports about what they did in the field. This is from an educator's perspective. All that's on the Polar Trek website. So another key thing is building community, and fortunately we have funding to help support this and nurture these relationships. We try to have researchers and educators get together before they go into the field, and then afterwards we use our alumni extensively to help train and to work with all of the educators. And then, of course, we have other mechanisms to connect people. We have a listserv, we do conferences and things like that. So we're always trying to build and sustain that community so that they can keep working together. Very quickly, I'm going to go into some of the data that we've gotten through our evaluation. This is the number of participants we've had in Polar Trek, and it only went up to we have one more cohort after that, so just add 11 to the total educators. I forgot to mention that we do split them. We try to do 6 in the Arctic, 6 in the Antarctic. That doesn't always happen because we don't always have matching expeditions. Antarctica is a very tough place to get to. So typically we have more Arctic expeditions, but so that just gives you, we're way over 200 now because of 2004 data is not included in there. Our evaluation is another signature activity, if you will, for our Polar Trek program. A lot of teacher research experiences, especially ones that are local at universities and things like that, are not evaluated, and that's fine. But obviously with a big program like ours and everything that happens with it, we needed to build that in. We wanted to know, are we being successful with all of our with all these different aspects of our program? Are people really benefiting it? Are we changing? Are we doing what we said we wanted to do? So we do have an evaluator. They've been working with us for a long time. These are currently our evaluation questions. What is the nature and quality of the processes used to promote educator capacity to teach STEM? What is the relationship between these processes and impact measures of educator knowledge of the polar regions and STEM instructional practices, educator science identity, and student interest in regions and in STEM and polar related STEM careers? So this is questions that our evaluators looking at it, and it's very wordy. But basically we want to know whether we're doing the right thing or not. Oops, lost my little cursor. And real quickly, I want to get a time check from Victoria because I lost track.
You have about 5 minutes.
Okay, perfect. That will help me. Okay, thank you. So I just want to emphasize, I'm not going to go into all the evaluation data, but if you are building education programs or doing research and you're trying to figure out how to put in education outreach into your research project, I cannot emphasize enough that you should consider adding some education questions to your research and or finding somebody to at least evaluate that aspect of your project. A lot of times researchers are very focused on their research, and the research questions is great, but they don't add that extra layer, which is asking whether the education outreach component of your project is really working or not. And of course, the reason why we have it is just like any research program, we want to know whether we're being successful or not. So, and it helps us justify our funding in the program. One thing that's different about our kind of evaluation is that it's a program evaluation. So, and we call it adaptive management. So we get information year after year, and it allows us to adjust our programming, which is really awesome. So I don't have to keep sticking with the same plan. If it didn't work, I get to change it. Oops, my computer almost timed out there. This is just to show you where what we're looking at through the evaluation. Of course, we're looking at students, educators, and researchers. And finally, have we been successful? Yes, we have been successful. So we have seen through both case studies and data over the last decade that teachers and educators significantly increase their knowledge about polar region science. They increase their use and their ability to use these practices in their classrooms or their learning settings. And students of them have also increased that they've learned more about the polar regions and are better at using science skills. And researchers also increase their knowledge about what is happening in the education community when they participate in these. And that for the most part, they've been positive professional relationships, and they continue long after the experience. So that's where I said I was going to skip. So I'm skipping. What is new in the current year is that we're looking at, on an evaluation, we're doing a network analysis. We want to see who participants are connecting with, because we say that those networks and those collaborations are really important, but we had no data to say who they're connecting with once they've started a Polar Trek experience. So we're looking at that. And then we're also looking at informal and formal educator relationships, and also does professional development practices lead to educator success? So those are kind of new things. COVID has had an impact on all of this. We only have 2 cohorts that have gone through the program. The most recent cohort of teachers is on hold. They're postponed until 2022 for the most part. We've had a few expeditions that have went out, but so we're kind of on hold due to COVID. Okay. I'm going to skip through this because I want to mention, so that's the Polar Trek program. And we hope to continue being funded, obviously, and get our teachers out in 2022. In the meantime, because of COVID, I've been involved in a lot of other things on the backside at ARCUS as well. We have another program called Arctic in the Classroom. And again, just go to the ARCUS website to look more in depth about all these. But this is a very Alaska-specific program where it's based on citizen science and community science, and we looked at 5 teams that worked in communities and how those practices worked. So that's the Arctic in the Classroom. I was involved in creating a workshop and some guidelines about how to conduct culturally responsive outreach in the Arctic. There is a document related to that. It's on the ARCUS website. We had an online conference last spring, and a document is being guidelines about how to better engage rural Alaska Native undergraduates and youth in Arctic STEM is coming out. It should be out in late September as a publication. And we are advertising right now for people to register and join us in this Community and Citizen Science in the Far North Conference. It's online, it's free. It starts October 5th through the 7th. If you have any connection or interest in community and citizen science, I encourage you to join that. And I'm also spearheading a rework of some of our lessons that the teachers had created over the years that focus on the Arctic Ocean and aligning them with culturally relevant perspectives and national NGSS standards, which are very US based. Anyway, we're hoping to build a collection of lessons that is centered on the Arctic Ocean. And that should be available in January of 2022. And I think that's it. That's a lot. So thank you. And again, reach out to me or any of my colleagues and about any of this. And thanks, Victoria. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Janet. And if everyone could please join me in giving a huge and thunderous virtual round of applause from all of our continents on our webinar. Thank you so much for such a thorough presentation. And I think one that genuinely got many people excited about exploring the program and maybe thinking about how they can bring some of your expertise and experiences into their own classrooms. So thank you. As a reminder, if you have questions for Janet about Polar Track, please type them in the chat box now. We'll be bringing our speaker back on at the end of our webinar for a robust question and answer session. So make sure to get those questions and comments ready. But for now, I am beyond excited to invite our second speaker to our virtual stage. Dr. Samantha Sayville is a teaching associate at the Scott Polar Research Institute and the Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge. She coordinates and teaches primarily on the geographies of the Arctic and the social science and humanities strand of the MPhil in polar studies. Her research has mostly centered on Svalbard, and today she is going to be presenting a humble approach to polar teaching. Sam, I am going to give over my virtual microphone to you to take it away.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Janet, for really, really interesting talk. I'll just get my screen up while I waffle. So hopefully that's working. Is everything okay with that? So this is going to take a bit more of an academic perspective, this talk. And whereas Janet has a wealth of experience over many years, I'm very new to teaching polar studies, basically. So I'm going to take you through my journey on that, really. And just to give you a little bit more personal background as how I came to working in this field, really. Unlike Janet, I didn't have childhood dreams of going to the Arctic and to cold places, really. I actually just sort of stumbled across a PhD project when I was looking to further my studies, and it was advertising a project all about Svalbard, and I kind of had to do a double take and went, oh, okay, that isn't just Philip Pullman's books with armored bears and things. It's a real place and it exists, and it sounds incredibly intriguing. And I was very involved in environmentalism at the time and teaching climate change, and I thought the chance to kind of explore this where it's happening on the ground right now was too interesting to kind of pass up. So I've turned myself into an Arctic enthusiast and a polar enthusiast by accident, I think. So I'm going to be reflecting on that and reflecting sort of directly on the sort of focus of the ice ceiling on gender and teaching in polar studies anyway. So I'm kind of going to go about this roughly by trying to answer the why of teaching gender and directly addressing this question in polar studies. My kind of background as to where I'm doing that, and the sort of position that I find myself in as a British white woman doing this teaching, not from the Arctic. Who I'm teaching, the kind of gender balances of the students and this kind of thing, and what I teach and how I try to go about it. And as Victoria said, I'm trying to bring in my approach of trying to bring in more humility into teaching and research in polar studies. So the why of why I'm trying to do this, really, the first sign is perhaps that brings me onto the radar of this is my early involvement in helping to try to promote the networking and information site run by Dr. Danita Burke, which is Women in the Arctic and Antarctic, which profiles women working and living at the poles. And why I got involved with this was, despite there being more and more women in polar research, there are still challenges both in achieving equality and sort of severe hangovers from the legacy of polar exploration, research, travel, dominated by men and stories of men, really. So when I was embarking on my own first steps in my research in Svalbard, I found it quite reassuring and inspiring in a way that these hangovers were being challenged and called out, and that I wasn't totally alone in a man's world. So I'm trying to pay that forwards by continuing to increase visibility of women in polar studies. And the British Antarctic Survey at the moment are running a diversity in polar science, a project on that to address wider concerns here. And their figures, while a bit limited, show that there is still work to do. There is still inequality in the UK's polar science environment, for sure, anyway. And similarly, the Arctic Council's endorsed gender equality on the Arctic Working Group. In their recent report notes that gender has been neglected in research and in governance. And a report from 5 years previous said that governance bodies in the Arctic weren't really taking gender equality seriously. So continuing the why from a more academic perspective, in a sense, I won't go into the detailed work and critiques of the history of polar exploration, of polar science and colonialism, but Lisa Bloom's Gender on Ice book is really a seminal work here that really exposes the ways that masculine ideals were woven into the narratives of polar exploration, and how constructing the Arctic as a blank and empty and sometimes female space that males could conquer added to their construction as ideal territories for colonial expansion, really. So she says the ideologies of gender were central to polar discovery. And polar exploration narratives played a prominent part in defining the social construction of masculinity. The polar explorer represented the epitome of manliness. And whereas Mark Carey and his co-authors have brought to light not only the historical but waning continued gender imbalance in glaciology, but also questioned the dominance of positivist knowledge about glaciers, so objective science, as the only way of knowing about the cryosphere, about our frozen environments, and the kinds of knowledge that's deemed valuable and useful and interesting could be expanded. And so really bringing a feminist glaciology approach, as he's termed it, which are like both of those goals to continue improvement in inclusivity as to who gets to produce knowledge about the cryosphere, and the kinds of knowledge that's deemed useful are both really important. So I endeavour to continue this work and these projects through my teaching, but it's perhaps at this point it's important to say that we ought to be going beyond sort of male and female binaries and understandings of gender, and recognise it as a fluid spectrum that's socially and culturally constructed, for sure, and that looking at gender inequalities separately from other ways in which people are discriminated against, such as ethnicity, race, sexuality, is very limited, and in the context of the Arctic, colonialism is especially relevant here. So as I said before, as a white British straight woman, then I should point out where exactly I'm coming from, and where the teaching that I do occurs, as this is relevant. So working as a geographer definitely comes with strong historical colonial legacy and baggage, as the practices of exploration and expeditions and mapping and surveying that geographers did 100 years ago or more, they were key facilitators of imperial activities and rule, and specifically Britain's imperial activities in both the Arctic and the Antarctic were substantial, exploitative, violent and damaging. And as Jason Dittmer and his co-authors have pointed out, we nevertheless see the continuation of a predominantly glorified age of exploration where masculinist fantasies play out, and this still occurs, whereas where I work at the Scott Polar Research Institute, is populated with academics that are critiquing this very masculinist fantasy and this legacy. There are also still represented within the walls of SPRI these historic narratives as well. You can see that on the flag in the Polar Museum there. When I started at the Department of Geography, where a third of academic staff and roughly half of research staff are women, colleagues there really asked after me, and they were worried that I was going to be quite outnumbered over at the Scott Polar Research Institute, given this portion of the website that I've got up here, where I'm the only female senior academic member of staff, which is to an extent true, but back in the days when we could actually meet up for coffee every day, it rarely came to my attention, and I never did feel that inequality, because there are many women in the research community, in the museum, in the administration, in the leadership positions held by women, such as Dr. Chandrika Nath, who works at the Scientific Committee for the Antarctic Research. So all is not as it appears, really, in terms of gender there. And there's also important progress to report in terms of increasing diversity in both institutions, in the geography department and at the Scott Polar Institute. So in geography, female undergraduates now outnumber males, and there's a significant effort at continuing to break down discrimination and inequalities and encourage and support historically minority groups and actively decolonize geography, including and especially in our teaching and research activities. And this goes for the Scott Polar Research Institute as well, and in all the areas of activities of the Institute, including the museum and the library. We're actively working to try to increasingly include and acknowledge the voices and the work of women and Indigenous Arctic communities and scholars. And we've actually got 2 PhD students working specifically on questions of gender in the Arctic and in Antarctic history. So Nai Zakaria is working on a project of the roles of women in Arctic field science from 1900 to 1950, and Morgan Siag has been working on gender and women's roles in institutional change in 20th century Antarctic science. So those are really exciting projects. And this progress really reflects the wider polar science environment, I think, whereas women were excluded up until the 90s from some areas of polar work, and gender wasn't really actively engaged with in research about the poles in a widespread way and up until the last sort of 2-3 decades. Now the Association for Polar Early Career Scientists has a 55% female membership, and increasingly women are seen in leadership roles. We're perhaps not at the level of gender mainstreaming, as the Arctic Council Working Group phrases it, where gender is considered in all interventions, activities and policies, but there is significant progress. And as Vladimirova and Habeck say in their paper on gender in polar studies or in Arctic studies, all fields of science and humanities in the circumpolar north have seen major changes in the way women and other previously underrepresented groups, such as Indigenous scholars, have come to participate in research and shape research agendas. So that's giving you the sense of the environment from which I teach and the direction of travel. So on to what I actually do there. As Victoria said at the start, I have other duties, but significantly I teach a final year undergraduate course, Geographies of the Arctic, with Dr. Michael Bravo. We cover a lot of content in that course, over 16 lectures and additional small group discussions, coursework. It runs over the 2 terms, teaching terms. And we use a lot of case studies. We try to give a good geographical coverage as well. We look at the relationships between the state and Indigenous peoples in different nation states, in Russia, in the Americas, in Scandinavia, in the Scandinavian Arctic and the Nordic Arctic. And we cover lots of different themes, so from resource extraction, tourism, globalization, development, and histories of exploration. And we try to take a really critical approach to all of that. And the essence of the course really is to get the students thinking about the Arctic critically, including as to how we define the Arctic, and to reflect on the the diverse peoples and places and processes and relationships that occur in the Arctic. And as Victoria said as well, at the beginning, I teach on the humanities and social science strand of the Masters in Polar Studies, and the graduate students on that course initially take a broad talk content where we encourage wide critical reading across the poles, covering topics such as post-colonial relations, public policy, ethnographies of science, infrastructure, very wide ranging again, before they go on and specialise in their individual research topics. So to briefly give you an idea of the gender split on this, over the last 10 years, the MPhil course, the master's course, has had 45 male students and 43 female candidates, so close to a 50-50 spread. And the 2 years that I've taught on the course, the previous 2 years have been majority female students, which has been sort of really nice to see. And looking back at previous databases, it shows quite, I suppose, an expected trend whereby females made up far less of the cohort, so around 35% of the candidates. On the undergraduate course, we've got less data as it hasn't been running as long, but it tends to follow roughly the overall trend in geography students being over 60% female across the discipline in most years. In terms of how I approach my teaching then, I'm very much trying to incorporate a similar approach to the research practice I espouse, which in short is to practice towards working towards humility. So I try to expand on the dictionary definition of being humble in my recent paper, Towards Humble Geographies. And a really large part of this is trying to accurately self-assess, trying to judge ourselves fairly, seeing both our limitations and also our strengths and successes. So yeah, very much recognizing failure and that research is a sort of ongoing process, and that those processes of research being a lot more messy, really trying to maintain this learning relationship with knowledge, and not think that we have got to a point where we know it all, basically. So with this student evaluations then, when we're taking this humble approach to practice, are really invaluable. And connected to this is realizing, as I said, that we don't know everything, and that the world and other people, including students, have got a lot to teach us. And in this, in research, we might be slower to come to conclusions, or be taking multiple approaches to analysis, or trying to take into account plural versions of knowledge and what counts as knowledge in our research. And I think this has been, at least to begin with, somewhat frustrating for students to engage with my lectures sometimes. I think my conclusion slides in lectures are often variations on the theme of it's complicated. But they do learn to kind of get there on their own, in a sense, and have their own takeaway messages. Humility also includes recognizing the role of other people, species, materials and infrastructure has on our interdependent relationships in life in general, but more specifically as academics. So in the paper, I linked this to citational practices, so referencing other people's research. And in doing this, in some ways, we have to be humble, because unless we're going to plagiarize other people's work and pass it off as our own, we need to recognize the work of others that have gone before us and what they've had to say about things and the research that they've done. But it does come with an ingrained politics and ingrained inequalities that have been all too easy to perpetuate, as the numbers that I quoted at the start said, that the polar research hasn't always been an equal playing field, and it's very much been male dominated in the past. So a lot of that polar research that we're building on, including in the social sciences and humanities, which is mainly where I teach, has been male dominated. So perpetuating that and only citing those male authors, those white authors, is challenging to kind of like break out from. But I've very much been trying to do that and incorporate more and more female and Indigenous authors in lectures and reading lists. And then very much about being a listening, vulnerable, responsive researcher, and listening to the context and the needs of the situation at hand, And I think this translates really well into teaching. So trying to adapt to students' needs, their interests, what kind of style of teaching and engagement works well with them. So in some ways this translates. Then following a paper from a couple of years ago by Danny Dorling, who's also a geographer, suggesting that we needed to be kinder as a discipline and address the way that we relate to students and how we can shift the discipline away from its colonial history and ongoing inequalities there. I think like this diagram here with the teacher as a transmitter of knowledge model, we know pretty much, and I'm sure Janet has very much contested this kind of thing, that the teacher as a transmitter of knowledge model doesn't really work, at least very well on its own. And we know we can learn a lot from our students, and that really our role is to activate and facilitate learning, to quote the cheesy saying, to be the guide on the side rather than the sage on the stage. And from my own experiences, I feel I'm certainly more comfortable as the guide on the side, but the setup with lectures in higher education, at least, is that you at least need to perform that role of the sage on the stage. So there's a bit of a contradiction there in terms of what we know works and the methods that we're still trying to use to deliver our teaching. But I think our lecture halls and our Zoom calls and our tutorials and our small group discussions would be better places if we could be more comfortable with the limits of our knowledge and to allow some of that humility that I was just talking about in the research context into our teaching. And that would help cultivate a more of a culture of kindness in that as well. And in some ways, I think the move online and the pandemic has helped me here in that we've been using a much more diverse set of methods to share materials. We've been really then making the most of our opportunities to listen to students and making the most of our live interactions with them when we get the chance. So sharing a lot more things online than we normally would do has sort of opened that out a little bit. But it is all too easy to feel like we should know everything and be able to answer all of the questions. So I think this is a continuing work in progress in this. And I think, yeah, as I said in the paper, I discussed the tension between authority and humility that confronts researchers trying to co-produce knowledge. And I think this certainly holds again in the teaching environment, where it's expected, especially as students are paying more and more for their courses, to serve up knowledge rather than to work towards co-producing it with students and having that as the group project of learning together. But I think many students by their final year realise that the challenge of working with other students and with their lecturers and to push the boundaries of knowledge is more rewarding than just being fed knowledge from people. So how I'm trying to apply this in the Arctic module I teach, the first thing that I have them do is reflect on their impressions of the Arctic that they arrive at the course with. And I think here the students on the module are very much a product of their cultural surroundings by and large, and their ideas about the Arctic are heavily influenced by the ongoing exhibitions, popular TV programs that continue to play off and represent polar discovery and expedition with strong flavours of heroic masculinist fantasy and images of pristine and melting endangered environments. But the students by this point are pretty well versed in thinking critically about research methods and decolonisation. So this is a quote that I've got up here on the slide here from the very first session that we had, the live discussion session of the course last year. I got them to post questions for the discussion beforehand, and they were not only really interested following their first lecture and beginning to engage with the essay questions that you'll see in a moment on gender, but they were questioning both my role as a non-Arctic Western educator and their role as students. So the student says, how do you balance evaluating your positionality as a Western researcher producing knowledge about Indigenous Arctic communities and the desire to understand and educate? And they're worried that that while we sort of say that Indigenous and Northern communities should be having more control over knowledge production, we're still trying to explore it without having ever been to the North, to the Arctic, and as non-Arctic Western students. So this this was a great point really to start the course with, I think, and it very much reflected my own concerns and awareness of my position. It was really great to have this out in the open early on, which is maybe something I'd been too timid to include outright in lectures beforehand, I think. So this was a learning point for me, in that I think we all got a lot from discussing this. In my response, which we can certainly discuss later, perhaps as an improvement point, was that it absolutely is in some ways very problematic that I'm attempting to guide them through a critical, but I am attempting to guide them through a critical approach. And we do attempt to include a wide variety of sources and aspects of the Arctic. And that while that is limited, what we can do as outside researchers with this Western perspective, if we're reflective on our position, we can limit the damage in a way, and that we're aware of the complexity, the diversity and the plurality of experiences and processes and environments and challenges in the Arctic and wider polar environment. So if we can be more aware of all those challenges and processes and diversity, we'll have better tools to combat the very simplified media narratives that the students would otherwise be understanding the Arctic with. And many of them have been in touch after the module finished to thank me for giving them a new viewpoint and challenging their conceptions about the Arctic. So in some ways we can report success on that. So continuing the how theme about how I go to try to connect with them and reflect on gender, I very much try to engage and use case studies and other people's research as well as my own that takes feminist approaches and takes gender as questions and intersectionality and Indigenous knowledges into the module's content, and very much trying to diversify the content. And that can be from simply, making sure that all my slides don't just have white men on them and have a variety of like images and quotes and material that's from all types of sources, but also the reading list and things that I'm getting them to engage with. But early on in the course, their very first essay that they write, they have a choice of 2 essays. One of them is more about analysing the role of the imaginary in general in the Arctic, and the other they could choose an essay that directly addresses the question of gender. So in the first year, they could choose this question on the Arctic maintains its long-standing role as a space for masculinist fantasy, and discuss that quote and debate whether they agreed with it. And then this year they could choose a question on why a gender analysis is relevant for understanding geographies of the Arctic. So I've put this graph up here because I noticed this year, and I thought maybe this was just me reflecting on it a little bit too much, that it was mostly female students that were engaging with the gender essay. And I don't want to read too much into these numbers because the numbers are small, and there are other things that go into their essay choice. For example, they reflect on these essays and discuss these essays in small groups, and so it benefits the group if some people do one question and some people do another. But it was very striking this year, especially, that it was mostly female students, only 3 male students engaged with the gender question. So I've been trying to reflect on why that is and how I can encourage a broader spectrum of students to engage with the question of gender. And I think some male students feel like they're not confident enough to engage with something they see as a women's issue. So I think we've got a kind of upcoming problem there, perhaps, to flag, and perhaps we can discuss that as well in the debate later. And the other thing I'm trying to do is diversify the materials. So because of those, the legacy of male-dominated polar studies, I am including more and more papers, and there is more and more research done by female and Indigenous scholars that gets put on the course, but I'm trying to also diversify the materials that we engage with. So I've been teaching this past year, their coursework was to analyse an Arctic film, and we have this choice of films this year, and we'll have a different choice next year. And I think that really engaged the students as to putting these kind of critical views about gender and colonial past and histories and presents in perspective, and brought it to life really by using film. So I think that was quite successful, and the students really actually I wasn't expecting them to say that they enjoyed doing coursework, but I think this year they really did do so. And then expanding the other things that I referenced, not just papers and books and articles and things, but also using podcasts and online seminar series, of which there are many more now that we're living so online, and social media and this kind of thing, where we find more and more diverse voices, I think, than in the standard academic environment. So that's another sort of option that I've been trying to engage with. So this is one of my vague conclusion slides. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but hopefully I'm about right. That I guess overall my reflections on gender in teaching polar studies is that there's an increasingly supportive environment as a female educator, but was also to address the topics of gender and inclusivity and diversity. And increasingly the scholarship is more diverse, but that there are hangovers from those legacies of discrimination, exclusion and colonialism that are perpetuating. So we need to kind of keep on the ball with it, I suppose. And that I think there's an inherent difficulties perhaps in trying to bring humility into teaching, but I'm not going to give up on that because I think it's really quite important. And perhaps as I sort of mentioned with the essays on gender, that we're sort of getting new anxieties about this. And perhaps as well, when we're talking about decolonizing, reflected in the students' question then on the discussion board, about how is it our place to say and to analyse from a Western colonial past perspective. So I'm kind of going to leave those open now and stop sharing, and hopefully they'll generate some discussion. Yeah, that's it, I think.
Thank you so much. And if again, everyone could please join me in giving Sam a huge virtual round of applause. I can hear that silent, thunderous applause across all of the countries that we have on our Zoom. Thank you for some really thought-provoking questions, some really great insights, and I think a wonderful narrative about your own journey and how you've brought that into not just teaching, but also research. So I am sure I wasn't the only one that was taking notes as you were talking. We have about 15 minutes left of our hour and a half today. So I am going to bring on our first superstar presenter, Janet, as well, to start us off on a robust question and answer. As a reminder, if you have questions for either of our speakers, please put those in the chat box, or you can go down to the participant icon on your screen and hit that raised hand button so I can bring you on. We have one question that has come up for both of you about any institutional pushback that you have had. And this is, I think, maybe a little different from both of you. So for Sam, there is more a question of, is your department, or generally, do you think academia is supportive of this shift? And is there anything that you have seen or you have experienced that are obstacles to moving towards the research and the approach to teaching that you presented? And then to Janet, is there institutional pushback from the schools that you engage, where educators are coming from these out of classroom experiences? And I think the questioner wants to know about those educators bringing that experience into set curriculum, and if there are challenges there. So maybe Janet, do you want to start us off as our first speaker? And then Sam, if you want to go next for some institutional challenges.
Sure. Yeah, great. Thanks for framing that as well, because my mind went all sorts of different directions. We have heard from our alumni and participants that there has been pushback, and sometimes we hear about it right away, like They might have issues with administration, supporting them, going, especially for the really long expeditions that take place during the school year. That's the reason why we do have substitute costs and reimburse schools, is hopefully that, kind of eases that situation a little bit. Most of the time that works. Sometimes it doesn't. And there have been a few teachers that have talked to, human resources and, maybe take personal time off for some of those expeditions, maybe not the full on thing, but they work with their administration to make it happen. An interesting pushback is that we've heard about, it's not all the time, but we do talk to the teachers after their expedition, and they've reflected that sometimes right away and sometimes years later, they have almost like jealousy from colleagues in their classrooms or in their workplaces, because so much emphasis was placed on them and being in the field, and they got all this PR and they're like a super teacher now or something. So it's just a perspective that has come back, and they've had to deal with it. So we do talk about that with the teachers that are going back to their workplaces, that you may have this pushback from actually people you work with because they're jealous about what you get, and how do you deal with that, and why you went. And finally, I'd say the last thing that we sometimes stumble across is maybe team members not all understanding why an educator is on a team, what their role is. Again, we have tried to counter that, or at least discuss it in webinars before the expedition with researchers about expectations. And, these are things that you might have to talk to other team members about. Why is there a teacher in the field with you, and what's their purpose?
Thanks. Do you want me to go next on that question? Thanks for the question. I guess I'm going to start positively by saying not so much, actually, or at least not directly, but the pushback that I have had, I think, most from perhaps is students, and in a positive direction, in that they would like more. They would like me to do a better job at including more women and more Indigenous scholars on the reading lists and in the materials. Some of them also take a post-colonial and decolonial course, and as part of that course, they get to choose a module to critique as not doing enough. So one student, which is kind of positive that not lots of people jumped on, but one student did, and took a very particular part of the course where I hadn't done as good a job as the rest of it, and kind of pointed out that most of the authors were still white male on this, and I was like, yeah, you're right, actually. I could do a lot more here. So that's one pushback in a really positive direction that I intend to act on. Otherwise, I think not too much. I mean, it does sometimes. I think that it does require a certain personality sometimes, and to be brave, to put yourself out there and to sort of, attempt to steer a different course. And sometimes I feel more brave than others. And and sometimes I feel like I've got more freedom than in other times. So I don't want to present a totally rosy picture and say that it's always easy for everyone all the time. I'm definitely not, but I'm trying.
Yeah, and I think that's probably true for the answer to both these questions. There are real highs and there are also challenges. So, that's part of the experiences, and also learning for those who might want to follow in your footsteps, which brings us to our next question, also to you, Sam, from Jeffrey, who wants to know, what advice or guidance do you have for early career professionals who are contemplating their positionality within circumpolar research?
That's a really good question. What advice do I have? I think trying to sort of, it's a boring answer in a sense, in that kind of trying to do your homework as to the history as what's gone on. I think for a long time I hadn't done that homework. I think especially as I was working in Svalbard, I was like, well, this isn't so bad. There's not an indigenous population here. So, you know, maybe I can just look at this. But the wider Arctic context of what has gone on elsewhere, despite there not being an indigenous population in Svalbard, I think it's really important to understand that and how it can affect the wider sort of Arctic and circumpolar research environment, I think. So not to discount those histories, I think, and try to get on board with that, but then and sit with it and reflect on it. And I mean, I'm starting to very much question my own role and what my role is in future research projects, and whether I'm the best person to do these things, and whether it might be better to step aside sometimes, which isn't what an early career researcher wants to hear. And that's not an easy path, and I'm still trying to find my way there. So I'm not sure. I'm sure Janet probably has better things to say on that. But yeah, I need some advice too.
Yeah, I think we all do. But maybe, Janet, you could also speak to this for early career professionals and early career educators who are having this incredibly unique experience.
Yeah, just real quickly, I do think that, educating yourself about where you're going and what are the issues, or who your class is a great start. I also posted online a little bit ago a master's thesis from a guy that's on our ARCUS board of directors. It's really about how do you engage with, in this instance, Inupiaq people and in Arctic Alaska, but it can transcend across some of the issues across circumpolar Arctic as well. So I think it's just, learning to, you asked the question, whoever asked that question, you asked that question, and clearly you're starting to think, what is it that I need to do to be better at what, and to better engage and connect. And there's a lot of issues. So I think educating yourself in the U.S., understanding, and if you work in the Arctic U.S. or Canadian Arctic, understand what happened with colonialism and how it impacts the education and the people that are there. And so just reading, understanding it, acknowledging it, that it exists. You may not be able to solve all those issues, but just acknowledging that there are issues and going in with an open mind, and then talking to the people that are there. That's all good starts.
Yeah, really great advice. We have a few more minutes. We still have some questions that have come in, but for anyone who has not yet asked a question, now is the time to put that in the chat box or let me know as we are finishing up our webinar. So Sappho has a question for you, Janet. Have classroom to classroom connections between teachers' home classes with Arctic classrooms ever been considered, especially now in a virtual world where we are just a Zoom call away? And they're thinking about the exponential impact of such connections beyond the amazing work you and your team are doing already.
Yes, great question. And the short answer is yes. We part of their planning on part of the educators planning on how they'll use this experience, which is one of our activities. They start to plan, like, are there other things that I can do with the experience? And connecting with the Arctic classrooms always is one of the key activities that people want to do. And how that happens and all the in-betweens. Sometimes it happens before they go to the field. A lot of times it happens after they've developed, especially if they're doing research in or near an Arctic community. They may develop relationships with those classrooms. And we also have Alaska educators, so they also do it the other way. They connect with classrooms outside of Alaska. So yes, it does happen, and it's a fantastic way to extend the experience and kind of build those connections. And I've seen some very creative thinking things. That's one really awesome thing about the program, is that I don't have to come up with all the all the activities. These people are just amazing educators and they are so creative. So they usually come up with all of this stuff. I just go, oh, that's awesome. So cool. Never would have thought of that. So yeah, it's cool.
That sounds like a pretty incredible job. I'm looking at the clock and we have about 2 minutes. So I will ask just this one final question from one of our live stream viewers, who is asking about interdisciplinary work. And they want to know from both of you, do you have any advice for bringing in both the natural scientists and social scientists together in either the educator side, so bringing both of those classrooms or many classrooms of social science and biology or history or geology together, and then for you, Sam, thinking about students and bringing different disciplines in conversation with each other. Yeah, maybe Sam, I'll hand it to you first, and then Janet, you can finish us off for the day.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, it's actually been really nice. As you probably know, Victoria, the MPhil, the master's course, there's a physical sciences strand and a humanities and social sciences strand, and we really try to encourage them both to kind of cross-fertilize. Especially at the beginning of the course, the physical scientists were very keen to sort of join in on when they had more time on the social science seminars and things. And we really got, I think everyone got a lot from that, learning. We could sort of, fact checking in senses like, is this how this happens in your discipline as well? And this kind of thing, and sharing experiences across that, and them becoming more aware of the politics behind what they're doing, and the political and social science strand becoming more aware of like that scientific environment and where they're operating. Absolutely only positive experiences there, I think. And certainly more of the students that are interested in glaciology are realizing that taking the human geography paper, the social sciences aspect of it at the same time really sort of opens out their perspective and really helps in that. Yeah. I won't say too much about the research environment because you didn't ask me about that. So I'll let Janet have the final word, as I know we're strapped for time.
Yeah, I think how we handle that is we have placements in a variety of different scientific disciplines. And one of the evaluation tools is that the participants, the teachers, they have to take a pre and post content test. And that's just to see if they're learning about not only their science, but the other science disciplines that are happening during their year. And it's always interesting. So it basically encourages them to learn about their cohort and what's happening and what kind of sciences they're in. So because we have a variety, social sciences and physical, etc., placements, then they get to learn about that. And they do take that back to their classroom. The students in their pre and post surveys also get to answer questions related about other science that they're learning. And we have seen them, most classroom teachers in particular will have assignments where the students have to follow other expeditions long before their expedition takes place. And so the students get to learn about all the different kinds of science disciplines that way. And of course, as polar science in general is becoming a lot more interdisciplinary, and it's particularly in the Arctic, and there's huge international projects, and so that also is an opportunity for exposure to all the different kinds of science that's taking place. So yeah, I think there's a lot more in this area that it needs to go, but that's our attempt at trying to make sure that at least the students and the participants understand that there's a lot of different kinds of science and it needs to be more interdisciplinary and also more collaborative, especially Arctic science.
And I think, the students in both of your experiences will expand those collaborations and those cross-disciplinary opportunities as will everyone else who joined us today. So I'm going to ask again for everyone to please join me in a final round of applause. Sam, Janet, thank you so much for being so generous with your experiences and expertise today. We so appreciate it. And thank you everyone for spending your morning, afternoon, evening with us. We also appreciate you being part of our Breaking the Ice Ceiling webinar series. As a reminder, this is part of a series of dozens of incredible women in the Arctic and Antarctic research, education, and experience spaces. And we hope to see you at upcoming webinars in the fall. Again, we will be sending out an email after this with the recording and opportunities to register for free for those upcoming webinars. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful end of their August.